Quick introduction here. I am Cameron Mac Millan. Talk today is, it's 2020, so why am I still able to read your pager traffic? And this came about from some rather unusual series of events, most of them involving setting up an SDR. And basically, I'm sorry, I appear to be having a slight control problem here. There we go. My background is a 25-year IT background with 20 of that being an infosec. And I really have a thing for old technology. I really enjoy it, especially stuff that's been considered obsolete or superseded. I think there's a lot of room within a lot of these technologies to overlook the security implications of them in certain environments, and that's something I enjoy poking around in. So with that out of the way, the overarching, point of this talk can be summarized thusly: creating tomorrow's problems with yesterday's technology. Because in the case of pagers, they're still very prevalent. They're out there, they're used. A lot of people are surprised to find out just how much they're used and why they can be a problem depending on which sectors you're operating in. So a little bit of background as to how I got to the point of making a talk about it. Well, first off, this was the big question. Did I forget to shut down the SDR again? And the answer to that was, yeah, for about 3 months. Basically, I'd set it up. It was sitting there capturing pager traffic just on kind of a test basis. And I literally just walked away and forgot about it. 3 months later, I logged back into the machine and it's still doing it. I was actually kind of surprised by the amount of data it had captured. And, it's like, okay, that's cool. But what do I do with it? Well, I'll just let it keep going, because realistically, it's working. And, maybe after a few months of looking at this, I can start analyzing that data and see if there's anything interesting. So what I learned was, yeah, that actually ended up being a whole lot more data than I thought it would be. I'd like to point out that this data was being captured over the air in the Oklahoma City metro area, which is, I believe, the 26th largest metropolitan area in the US. If it had been in a larger one, these numbers would likely have been a whole lot higher. But I've still got a gig of data to have to plow through here. All right, well, what do I do with it? Analyze it. And let's talk about this to other people, because there's some things that came up in the analysis process that I felt kind of needed to be addressed related to this topic. So briefly, what we'll be going over here is quick history of paging, where it came from, how it works, why it's still in use, operationally, what it does. It's going to be very much a high-level overview, not in-depth, getting out into the technical weeds on it. Who's still using it and why? And this is important in understanding why the technology still survives to this day. There's a few interesting things in there. Finally, how do we go ahead and capture and decode that traffic? Once you've got it, what do you need to do it? Is this a high cost, low cost potential avenue of attack, or is this something that pretty much anybody can do? Then once you've got it, what are you looking at? You've got to go through this, filter it, get the weed out from the chaff, and basically determine how much of a threat or hobbyist you actually are. Oh yeah, this one. Yeah, that's not happening. Yeah, no, just ignore that strikeout. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so one thing not to expect from this talk, and this is something I really want to make very clear, because again, going back to things I ran across in the process of researching, there was a lot of this. And pretty much what it boils down to is that it seems as though every couple or 3 years, somebody discovers that, hey, did you know you can make an SDR and run software and like read pager traffic? This is like what evil hacksaws do. Yeah, okay, so guess what? This is not new. People have been doing this since the 1980s. It's all out there, it's been known, Yes, it's still a threat vector, potentially. And I want to remove some of the hype that has surrounded the fact that this is something that's capable of being done. So that's pretty much one of the things I'm going to incorporate into this discussion, very much letting people know that, yeah, it's a problem. It's out there. You can do it. All the tools are available. But, people hunched over laptops in black hoodies with matrix text raining down behind them aren't just using this 24 hours a day to destroy you. So the ubiquitous legal disclaimer. And I'm going to read this in full just so that there's no question about it. Per FCC guidelines regarding the interception and divulgence of radio communications, reception and decoding, as opposed to decryption, of pager transmissions in the United States does not appear to be illegal. However, divulging the contents of those transmissions may be illegal in certain circumstances. It should therefore be noted that all examples of captured pager traffic presented herein have been sanitized. Information that may divulge or otherwise make recognizable the original message content of the traffic as received has been altered or removed. Every effort has been made to sanitize the presented traffic captures sympathetically so that their importance in context is not diminished for the audience. And with that out of the way, if anyone can tell me what video and song this still was taken from, I'll send you a pager. I'm serious about that. I will send you a pager. So getting on to a history of it. In 1976, Post Office Code Standardization Advisory Group in the UK collaborates with industry and government bodies on creating a standard paging protocol. This basically was the first more or less universally accepted protocol for paging since the European and Japanese manufacturers adopted it. At some point, the US did also adopt POXAG, but it's not entirely clear as to when. It was early 80s, probably 83, 82-ish, but I couldn't find any solid info on that. But suffice to say, about 40 years ago. In the mid-1980s, there was a big change here. Alphanumeric pagers were introduced. Up to this point, pagers could only do two things: beep or buzz, or display a numeric message. Now they can also display text, so you're getting closer to a device that has SMS-like capabilities, although they're only one way. In '93, Motorola introduces the Flex protocol, and this essentially builds on POXAG's capabilities. It's much higher data rate, has a little bit of error correction in there, but not a great deal. But POXAG still remained in use. And it's important to note that these two protocols existed side by side. Flex is pretty much dominant today. You don't see a whole lot of POXAG out there, but it is still in use. 95, two-way paging is introduced. And it's pretty much what you would imagine it to be. You essentially have a handheld pager with a keyboard that can do what is effectively two-way texting. If you imagine on your cell phone right now, you get a text message, you read it, you reply to it, pretty much the exact same thing. But it wasn't really all that successful because by the year 2000, cell phones were starting to become more and more ubiquitous. In 2001, Motorola saw the writing on the wall and they got out of paging. 2020 though, paging's still in use. And it's in use mainly in some very specialized areas. And we'll come back to those later. It's very important to understand why it's still in use based on the sectors that are using it. So, brief run through of how paging works. Anybody who's over the age of 30 will probably know this, but anyone who isn't may find this slightly interesting. So, person wishing to send a message either dials in to a service and punches in the message, hits pound and hangs up, or hits a web gateway, hits send. That is then submitted to the paging system run by the pager network, and it prepares that message to be transmitted. Now, those pages are sent to every transmitter that paging network has, and effectively is broadcast in an extremely wide area. This will become important later. So, transmitter site squirts it out over the airwaves. Now note that all the transmitters in this example are on the same frequency. This is intentional, and we'll come back to this in a minute. Now, the pager alerts if a message on the frequency that the pager is tuned to is intended for that pager. If it is, you get your message. Very much of critical importance here, as you can tell. So this brings up a question. If all the pagers in a system are on the same frequency, how are messages only sent to specific pagers? Well, I'm glad that question was asked. Basically, each pager has what's known as a cap code. This is fundamentally similar to a MAC address in that it uniquely identifies that pager's hardware. And pagers receive all the messages on their frequency, but if a message isn't intended for their cap code, they just reject it and don't display it. It just silently disappears. It never shows or beeps or buzzes. Now, there are actually multiple cap codes that can be programmed into pagers, but a lot of those have special functions, let's say. For example, groups. You can have 20 pagers be part of a, let's say, organizational group for a restaurant. They also use them for over-the-air programming and sometimes network checking and stuff like that. So, what are the problems with this? Well, paging's one way. There are no retries. If your pager is off, the battery's dead, it's out of range, whatever, the message just goes off into the ether. Now, realistically, the message will be repeated a certain number of times just to make sure that it's received. And it's up to the pager in that case to say, oh, I already received this message, I displayed it, I don't need to display multiple copies of this message. However, it's heavily dependent on the paging network as to how that works. You know, some of them might cycle messages for 24 hours. Some of them might only do it for 2 or 3 minutes. Some might not do it at all. Now, there is no network level authentication of pagers. I mean, literally, they're tuned to a frequency. They have a cap code. This means they can be cloned. It also means that it's entirely possible to just drop one onto a paging network if you know the frequency and a valid cap code for that paging network. And that's actually something that's pretty easy to determine. And by default, being something intended for use starting 40 years ago, nothing's encrypted. And anyone is capable of receiving, decoding, and reading messages that are sent out over a pager network. Any encryption that happens has to happen at the message level before the message is transmitted. And it's also possible to do some spoofing here. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So, figuring out who is still using pagers and why. What's the attraction? You know, we've all got cell phones. We've all got a million other ways to communicate. Why pagers? Well, here's why. Virtually no private individuals are still using it for communication. Nobody's using it to tell the kids, hey, call home when you get to the library, you know, stuff like that. Nobody's using, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but the places where private individuals are still using paging tend to be very specialized. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, what paging does tend to be used for is response to situations that require immediate human contact or response to them. And if you want to keep your location a secret, this is a pretty good way of doing it. Because it's not two-way, there's no beaconing back to, say, a cell tower. There isn't really a good way to triangulate someone. Granted, if you're found with a pager with a particular cap code in your possession, that may be able to tie you to something, but you have to be found first. And given the wide areas over which paging networks operate, that could be hundreds of square miles. So, who's still using it? Well, first responders. And again, you know, traffic analysis showed this. One of the big users are volunteer fire departments, EMS, and in some cases, police. And not extensively with police. It's mostly volunteer fire and EMS, usually in more remote areas where cellular coverage may not be an option, but they know they can get pager coverage. You know, it's a way to dispatch and communicate with them, granted only one way, but it still provides field communication in areas that it may otherwise be possible. IT departments. They're still using them. And for certain types of alerting, they can be very useful. Okay, server's down. We've got a critical event happening over here on the core switch, things like that. You simply tie it into your SIM platform. It would typically email a gateway address and then transmit out in the event of something going down hard. Now, this one's kind of interesting. Industrial process monitors and SCADA. It's almost more the industrial process monitors that I observed than the SCADA stuff, but I was getting a surprising amount of it. And not huge, but enough to take note of it. And again, this kind of comes back to why IT departments still use pagers. Something breaks, need immediate notification, need to make sure that message might be received by multiple people at once, need to be able to do it in a way that's relatively reliable. Well, there you go. Transport and logistics. There are applications that are still used, mostly in trucking, to a lesser extent shipping, but there are still applications that are used to directly communicate with drivers, pilots, captains, what have you, regarding changes to routes, changes to loads, things like that. Essentially, again, quick one-way communication with a high likelihood of being received. But here's the big one. Healthcare. Healthcare loves pagers. They were by far, far, far and away identifiably the single biggest user of paging out of all the traffic I looked at. And this one is actually the one that concerns me. Well, I should say concerns me the most. It's not terribly well used. What I have found are a great many operational security failures in how healthcare continues to use pagers. Now, it's interesting, over the course of a year, that did seem to improve somewhat. I did actually notice certain things that were happening ceasing, but we'll come back to this in a little bit because this is a big one if you're in healthcare. But then we also have criminal activity. And this again comes back to location, specifically not being able to pin someone to a specific location, but being able to transmit information to them. One of the more interesting things I ran across in this was sports scores. There would literally be pages that consisted of dozens of lines of what were sports scores. Well, okay, why would anybody do this? So it's really simple. If you're running an illegal bookmaking operation, you can receive those scores on your pager, no internet required, no cellular connection required, and you can basically operate without any real network level, without any real network level monitoring of what you're doing taking place. Now, granted, there are other things it could be used for in terms of criminal activity, but that was the one that seemed to be surprisingly blasé about it. Because ultimately, when you're just broadcasting sports scores, okay, there's nothing wrong with that. When you're broadcasting sports scores with Las Vegas odds attached to them, that paints a different picture. So, yeah, there are people out there who are still using it for some under-the-table stuff. So, since there are alternatives, why is this still in use? Well, it's a valid question. This is a technology that we know. It's 40 years old. It's debugged. Pardon me. We know how to set it up. We know how to use it. We know how to keep it running. And in terms of what it does, it's actually pretty robust. I mean, all you do is transmit and receive. That's it. Very, very simple. This is another important one. The frequencies that cellular phones operate on tend to be ones that don't do well inside a building. Some do better than others, but they're typically not great. Paging frequencies, especially ones in the 900 megahertz range, do very, very well inside buildings. It's just a wavelength that does a good job of penetrating walls, roofs, ceilings, typically. So, you know, you send your message, there's a good chance people are going to get it if they're in the middle of a building. Now, this one's also important. You can get coverage from literally a small campus all the way up to national. And this also becomes an operational security consideration. So let's say, going back to our volunteer fire department example, let's say you're a volunteer fire department in a remote area, and whoever has signed up for your paging plan with the paging provider just checked a box, didn't really look at what was being offered and pay attention to the services. Well, it's entirely possible that your VFD's calls are now going to be sent out at a national level, which means pretty much anybody in any area where there's a paging tower capable of transmitting those pages is going to be transmitting those calls to an audience that was never intended to receive it. This is actually a bigger problem than just, that volunteer fire department example I'm giving. We'll talk about that a little further on, specifically in the context of a company who should know better, but apparently doesn't. And the big one, it just works. People are accustomed to carrying pagers. It's like, well, we've done this for 35, 40 years. Everybody knows how to do it. They can deal with it. We're just going to keep slinging them a pager. We don't want to upgrade what we have in place. So tough. Get to know and love your Motorola Bravo. All right, so here's what you need to do. Modern context, let's say you just want this to be something you either fiddle with because you really love doing stuff with radio and digital modes, or you want to potentially be a threat. Well, here's the obvious one. Get hardware. You're going to need hardware to receive traffic, so go buy some. Start small. If this is, baby's first SDR, that's cool. Just get something like a Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi 4 is a fantastic machine in terms of processing power for doing this, and everything you need can be put together for less than $100. Raspberry Pi, DVB-T USB dongle, and some open source software. One thing I will add, make sure that if you get a dongle, it includes a telescopic antenna. The ones you get that have the sort of curly, almost pigtail looking masts on them, those are tuned to single specific center frequencies. If you're using those, you're going to lose a whole bunch of stuff outside of what they're designed to receive. With a telescopic antenna, you're able to change the length and thus basically the frequencies that it can receive. You can go higher or lower as needed. All right, so you've got all your hardware put together. Now you need software. We'll start with GQRX. This is basically your visualization for what's happening in the radio spectrum you're working on. Gives you a waterfall display, a way to tune the dongle to specific frequencies, and essentially just, control. It turns your Raspberry Pi into a software-defined radio, which you can then control through GQRX. Okay, next up, Multimon NG, Multimon Next Generation. This is what I used for decoding the pager traffic. It does more than just pager traffic. It's designed to decode a number of digital modes, but Multimon's pretty good. It does what it does, and perfectly matched for what we're doing here. So, RTL SDR. This is actually command line based. There are some cases where you may not want to be running, something with a complete GUI. If you want to do this headless, for example, you don't necessarily need to have X windows with GQRX running on top of it. And if you're doing stuff, also out of shell scripts, GQRX isn't manipulated that well through those. So RTL SDR is a handy little tool to have around. Okay, because I'm old, I still call it Netcat, even though I know NCAT is what I want to use. These are your network Swiss Army knives. And what you're going to use these for is essentially connecting GQRX to SOCs for audio processing. GQRX outputs audio streams as UDP. NCAT or Netcat takes that UDP output, pipes it into SOCs and libmpeg123. And at that point, you can actually see what it is that you're receiving over the air. So here's how you do it. Start GQRX, tune to the frequency you want, turn on UDP audio output, start it receiving. Process the audio, decode the traffic, write it out to a file, which will grow to a gig in size over the space of a year at least. And there's your command line for it. I mean, this is all it is. Nothing particularly specific. Start NCAT, have it listen localhost on port 7355 UDP, pipe that out to SOCs, let SOCs do some processing on it, pipe that out to Multimon NG. That'll do decoding on, that will do decoding of the traffic as either POXAG 512, POXAG 1200, POXAG 2400, or Flex. And finally, dump it all out to a file. Just have it write it out and see what you got later. So, I'm PagerDump.txt and I contain decoded pager traffic. Boy, do I ever. So let's talk a little bit about what you're going to find. This would be a typical sort of message that you would find in there. And it pretty much is what you are pulling off the air. So Flex, that's the transmission protocol. As mentioned, there are others, POXAG, being the other kind of major one, but this is it. There's your protocol, great. Date and timestamp, pretty self-evident. This one, now this is interesting because this basically tells you what type of Flex is in use. 3200 4Ka. Now that breaks down to baud rate, which can also be, I believe, 2400 or 6400. The frequency shift keying type, of which there are several within Flex, header flags, and the flex phase. For the most part, the header flags and flex phase aren't necessarily things you're going to care about too much. We're not going to really cover those, but if you want to dig into it, they are worth it just to have a little better understanding of the protocol. All right, 01.053. Well, cycle number dot frame number. Think of that as being kind of like a TCP sequence number for paging. It's not 100% analogous, but it's close enough for government work. Now, this is where we start getting into some interesting stuff. 2323232323. That is the cap code of the pager that the message is intended for. This is transmitted in the clear, pretty much exactly as you see it. This can also be a group number, and group numbers are typically shorter than regular cap codes. You may recall earlier we spoke about there being secondary cap codes that can be used for things like identifying groups. Well, if this is a group number, every pager that has that group number programmed into it will display the message. Next up, ALN, message type. That can be alphanumeric, numeric, tone, or unknown. Alphanumeric, pretty much what it suggests, letters and numbers. Numeric, you just get a number. That's it. 555 2368. Tone. Tone only causes the device to beep or buzz. And where this would be used is in paging systems where you call back to a central number to either collect messages or pages and have them read to you either by a human or a computer. Unknown, yeah, we don't know what this is. Something maybe was garbled in the headers. I mean, who knows? But basically, we couldn't make heads or tails of it, but it did at least look like it was pager traffic. And finally, the payload. This is your actual message. Eat at Arby's or whatever it says. So, talking a little bit about the data mining involved in this. So, before we get into the percentages, as mentioned, there was quite a bit of traffic to go through. And I initially went at this trying to swat flies with a Buick. I took kind of a big data approach to it, and I threw big data tools at it. This turned out to be actually a far less efficient approach than using grep sed knock. Ultimately, I had a flat file, and that flat file was more easily gone through by hand with just standard text manipulation tools than it was trying to build queries in like KNIME or something to handle the data. And this is because it turned out that most of what you were likely to want to do with this data didn't actually involve insight much beyond finding commonalities. So I kind of went at this with stone tools and bearskins. If you want to go at this with something else, that's great, but it may not be totally necessary if you're doing this. So anyhow, here's a rough breakdown of what types of messages we're seeing. So you can see here over the year, 9.5 million messages. We'll call it 10 million. 52% of those, 55% of those were alphanumeric. Of numeric, 22%. Tone actually kind of surprised me. There was still that much tone in use, but that was interesting. And unknown, rejects. Outliers. This one's a little difficult to quantify. There were a number of types of messages that were failures, but they weren't failures in the same way that the unknowns were. So as you can see, 8% of the traffic was those outliers. Not really going to get too deep into those, but it was interesting to see that the networks were able to produce stuff that the software, for whatever reason, couldn't handle. So that tells me there is a little bit of margin of error in here. So you do need to go through your data and do some tidying before you start really digging into what's in there. Now, breaking the traffic down by hour of day. This is unsurprising. It starts to ramp up around 6 a.m. and it tends to ramp down around 8 p.m. So you've got a 14-hour spread during which activity is most predominant. And of course, middle of the day, it's highest. Looking at who's using these things, healthcare in particular, that's not surprising. I was surprised it went as quiet as it did overnight, especially on weekends. Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays actually tended to follow this same pattern pretty closely. And well, because it's the weekend, people tend to do things that get them into hospital at night more frequently. All right, so out of this, top 10 cap codes. What this is in each category, who were the top 10 recipients? Well, for alphanumeric, it was 10 pagers were 28% of the traffic. Numeric, 38%, tone 51%, and unknown were 55%. Now, some of these things are obvious. Shouldn't have logged to a flat file. Really should have been writing this out to a database so that it could have been queried, but it didn't really matter all that much in the long run. The output does definitely need to be cleaned up before it's written. You cannot just write it out as multimon ng formats it. You really do need to have it broken down into tab separated or comma separated values. And if you want to get seriously into it, and I mean seriously into it, AI or machine learning may be necessary for deep inspection. Just given the sheer amount of traffic that potentially can be received, as well as the types of traffic, correlating this would reach a point pretty quickly where one person or a group of people working together wouldn't necessarily be able to handle this on their own. So, remember earlier that section in the intro, strikeout, what strikeout? Well, there's a reason why that's there. This part of the talk had been intended to be the one where I went through and showed everybody, suitably redacted, the really dumb things that people continue broadcasting over the pager networks. However, after some consultation with people who have a better understanding of the judicial system than I decided to remove this. Unfortunately, that happened about 48 hours ago, and I have not had a good way to restructure it in that time. So what I'm going to do here is speak in general terms about some of these things. You may recall earlier that I mentioned a large and humorless company that should know better and their use of paging. Well, I won't name names. I will not show traffic that was pulled off the air, even in a redacted state. However, what I can say is that this company did an excellent job of broadcasting confidential client data, some of which had clients with .mil addresses. In addition to that, they broadcast names, telephone numbers, locations, and in some cases, quantities and models of items being ordered. Why this is happening, I don't know. What's interesting is that this was actually something that was a change that happened after I had already started monitoring. Doing this starting in, when was it? April of last year, I think. This traffic wasn't there. And then literally one day it just popped up. And this tells me that somebody, probably with good intentions, but not knowing the impact of their actions, decided that this would be a good time to CC whatever email address was used for the pager gateway at that company and just start blurting this all over the airwaves. Interesting part about this, they're doing it nationally. It's not just localized to the Oklahoma City area. I've been able to use remote SDRs in a couple of other locations, record some audio, process it, and determine that, yes, the same message I just received here is also being transmitted in, I don't know, let's say Idaho or Nevada. Similarly, law enforcement, and actually not directly law enforcement. There is a contractor to a police department in a well-known desert city, that's all I will say, that responds to requests from that police department to attend certain types of crime scenes. They're also paying for national service. Very interesting finding the pages to respond to a homicide scene from them. So anyhow, coming back to the point, is there a threat here? Well, yeah, the answer is there is, potentially. However, if you're going to have a threat, in most cases, that threat can be summarized as OPSEC failure. Pretty much if you're doing something that, for want of a better term, exposes your data, it's going to happen. Look at the example of, oh yeah, we've got this box in the corner and we don't know what it does. Well, okay, you don't know what it does, but that box pretty much is the one that's running your pager gateway. It could be a mail server with an email address. It could even be in-house. Now, the risk of this is going to be determined heavily by the industry you're in. Obviously, healthcare is the big one. And it's entirely possible that this, paging was something that was implemented 5 IT departments ago. People are kind of vaguely aware that it's there because everybody carries a pager, but nobody's really paying attention to it because it just kind of works. And it's that thing that's on that box in the corner of the server room that you don't really know what it does, but you don't turn it off either because you don't know what's going to happen. So realistically, that's what causes things like patient data to be leaked. And from a HIPAA standpoint, HIPAA compliance standpoint, that's a big problem. And healthcare does this a lot. The other thing is you may have IT staff who are unaware of the fact that compliance means encryption. I would hate to think that is actually the case today, but it does happen. Or they're unaware that they can actually subscribe to encrypted paging services who will encrypt everything before it goes out over the airwaves, but still allow people to use their traditional pager equipment. So in any event, I think at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to questions. If anybody would like to ask anything, please go right ahead.
You're ready, sir.
Ooh.
If you need to, what? Did you want to do a screen share?
Nah, there's no reason. I'm just going to
Okay.
babble about us.
Okay. Well, we have with us Kevin Johnson from Secure Ideas. Secure Ideas has been with us. Have you been with us all 6 years? I think
You know what? I think so, but I'm not sure.
Okay,
Considering the fact Nathan works with us, I think the answer is yes.
I think you have been. So we really appreciate all the support you've given us over the years. You've
We
done
like you
amazing,
guys.
and we appreciate it. And we glad to see that you're enjoying the con, and we're always glad to have you back. And would you like to tell us a little bit about Secure Ideas?
Sure. I always hate doing these types of talks because it's like, hey, let me brag about my company, and that just seems rude. But for the people who don't know, I'm one of the founders of Secure Ideas. We are a consulting firm based in Jacksonville with offices in Charlotte and people in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and Texas. We actually are pretty excited. This year is our 10th anniversary. We've been a company for 10 years, and considering the fact we were an accident that started, 10 years is pretty dang good. Of course, we got a few weeks until we hit the 10 years, so I might be cursing us by saying that. So we're a consulting firm. We basically do penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, architecture reviews, consulting. The big thing we want people to know about is our training. We've got a few classes that we just recently announced that are coming up. And if you have any questions, we do veteran discounts. So if you're a military veteran, we've got a lot of good discounts coming out. And we also offer free services to nonprofit charities. I think that's important to let people know about. We want to help as much as possible. The one qualifier there is you have to be a nonprofit charity that we are okay with. What I mean by that is, not that we have to agree with your message or stuff like that, right? But you can't be a jerk charity. It turns out that Westboro Baptist Church and some Klan organizations are federally recognized as nonprofit charities, and they don't get free services from us. So that's what we mean by don't be a jerk charity. We think that's fair. So that's us. If you want to, secureideas.com is our website, and anytime you want, you can reach out to me at kevin@secureideas.com. Yes, the professional evil logo. We love that sticker. Do you know how often that sticker gets us work? Here's where it happens good, and let's be very clear, the evil part of me giggles at this every single time. We very often have customers come to us and say, hey, we'd like to hire you. And when we say, well, how did you hear about us? Their answer is, oh, our consultants from last year had your slogan on their laptop, so we thought we should call you. So thank you for putting that sticker as many places as possible.
Oh, absolutely, sir. I have a new device every year at the con, and I'm always looking for my new next sticker.
Hey, well,
So
hey,
appreciate it.
Has Nathan gotten you T-shirts or other swag?
Yeah, we've got swag all over the place here, sir.
Okay, good. Well, I mean,
So
for you.
I'm sure we've got. There's a bunch of stuff on the other side of the wall I haven't seen yet.
Good. So cool. That, like I said, that's us. I don't do a big, hey, we're awesome. I don't know. I always hate doing sponsor stuff. So, but yeah, we're around. And BSides Oklahoma is one of our favorite conferences to come out to. I'm sorry that we weren't able to come out this year. So
we're very grateful for you to loan us Nathan. He's done an outstanding job with the organization, and it's really helped us help grow the organization.
He paid you to say that, didn't he?
I couldn't comment on that, sir. No.
Yeah, no, understood. If he didn't pay you, he should. So
no, it's Nathan's done an outstanding job with this organization, so you should be very proud of him.
We like him. So, well, thank you very much, man. I hope the rest of the con goes as well. And oh man, that is awesome. That is awesome how that came across. So when you're done, tell Nathan to check out the absolutely inappropriate meme I shared with him.
That's awesome, sir. Cool. Well, again, thank you for your sponsorship. We're very grateful to have you, and thank you.
Definitely. We'll see you next year.
All right. All right.